afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Yevna Knezhevich, the Associate Director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, also known as CREASE, here at Stanford. And on behalf of the Center, we are very pleased today to be hosting this talk by Mike McFaul, the former ambassador to Russia, and also a former CREASE student, or CREASEnik, as we call them. CREASE is proud to be part of the Stanford Global Studies Division, and now I would like to invite the Director of Stanford Global Studies and Professor of History, Norman Neymark, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. This is a really nice moment of kind of welcome back to Mike McFaul, who is one of our CREASE graduates and a distinguished colleague and friend. And actually, I realized last night when you were talking, we studied both with Alex Dallin, so kind of a co-student as well, even though he's a few years younger than I am. Well, we did get a few gray hairs in Russia. Okay, let me do this. Accurately. We're delighted to have Mike McFaul here, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia. He was previously chief advisor on Russia and Eurasia to President Obama, and senior director at the National Security Council from 2008 to 2011. He's a former director here at Stanford of the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, and former deputy director of Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's also the Peter and Helen Bing Senior Fellow at the Brewer Institution, where he's been very active for a number of years and will be active again. Mike is the author and editor of several monographs on Soviet history and politics. Let me mention a few of them. With Anders Aslund, he wrote and edited The Revolution in Orange, The Origins of Ukraine's Democratic Breakthrough, so a very relevant book. Today, in fact, all of his books are relevant to what's going on. Another book which he did is called Between Dictatorship and Democracy, Russian Post-Communist Political Reform, 2004, and also with a colleague and friend, Catherine Stoner. He edited After the Collapse of Democracy, the Russian elections of 1999 and 2000. Actually wrote that. A further book, Russia's Unfinished Revolution, Political Change from Gorbachev to Putin. So with all of this academic background, as well as a distinguished career in government, for which we are always grateful, I'm pleased to introduce Mike McFaul.
Thank you, Norm. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Good to see there's still interest in Russia here on the campus. I think that has more to do with Mr. Putin than me. But it's great to be here. I am in adjustment. I want to warn you, I'm a recovering bureaucrat and aspiring academic again, but I'm somewhere in between right now. And so what I'm going to do today is somewhere in between my previous life as a government official, my previous life as ambassador, and my aspirations to be more analytic and to digest some of the history that I witnessed before, but then experienced and was a part of. And I want to start with the confession. Hello. I've seen all kinds of people I haven't seen for a while. Good to see you here. I want to start with an emotion, not an analytic statement. I find the present moment in U.S.-Russian relations to be tragic, very tragic. To me, it ends what we used to call the post-Cold War era, for sure. And I'm going to tease you with trying to explain what comes after that. I'm going to give you a very wishy-washy answer. It's kind of like the Cold War, kind of not. But this period starts around the period that I got interested in the Soviet Union. around the time that I was studying here as a pre-student. Mikhail Gorbachev had just become the general secretary. There's this moment of optimism. I then lived in the Soviet Union in the 80s, including 1990, 91, at MU, Moscow State University. And that period and the subsequent years was a time when it looked like the Cold War was ending and relations between our two countries were becoming closer. And internal change inside Russia was also moving in a more pro-democratic, pro-market, and non-imperial way. So why did it happen? Why is it so tragic? What happened over the last 30 years? That's the question I'm going to answer at the end. But I'm going to give you my partial answer now so you can follow my argument. My argument is going to be mostly about contingency, individuals, and lost opportunity. I'm going to refute, or try to refute, and then you're going to tell me why I'm wrong when I finish. These bigger structural, historical arguments that, well, we have conflict with Russia because we always had conflict with Russia. I don't buy that argument. We have conflict with Russia because Russia is a great power. I don't buy that argument. We have conflict with Russia because they're an imperial country. They've always been an imperial country. I don't buy that argument. And the reason I don't, and I'm going to expand on this in particular, is because of my own historical experience in the government during a period that we call the reset. And in that period, as I'm going to go through in some detail, we had a different relationship with this country called Russia, this imperial country, this autocratic country, this anti-Western country called Russia. And so if I can convince you just for a little bit that just 3 years ago it was different, then that is my reputation of these arguments that go back 20, 30, 200, 500 years that make the case that conflict with Russia was inevitable. So that's going to be my argument. I'm going to spell it out. And then I want you to tell me what's wrong with it, because I understand my biases as an Obama administration official, and I want you to tell me why I'm wrong about that. So is it the Cold War? My answer is yes and no. But I want to get there by explaining why I think this has more to do with actors and institutions and not these long-term structural things. So first of all, let me just tell you my way of thinking, and I'm going to go quickly through these slides. I'm not going to read them. You're going to have to read them. Can you read them in the back, just so I know? Okay, good. Because I don't have time to read them. And there are going to be a lot of pictures, too. Don't worry. Not a lot of text. But this is kind of the way I would describe what was happening over the last 25, 30 years. First, internal transformation inside the Soviet Union and then Russia. And transition for me is too small a word. This is a revolution. Think of your biggest word for big change, and that's what's going on. Because you have this triple transformation happening simultaneously. End of an empire, end of a command economy, and end of dictatorship. Whether you call it totalitarian dictatorship or autocratic dictatorship, we could argue about. But whatever you call it, it was not democracy. And all three of those things were under transformation internally at the same time. At the same time, you had a project that I call international integration, bringing Russia into international institutions, economic practices, and even, I would dare say, societal integration, not necessarily through institutions. That's the post-Cold War order, the way I was thinking about it for the last 20, 30 years. Now, with those projects came a reaction to it, of course. And in this room, I don't think I have to explain it. Lament about the collapse of the USSR. Not everybody thought that was a great thing. I did. I thought it was a great thing. I remember it. I celebrated it. I had friends in Russia who celebrated it. So it wasn't just an East versus West thing. But there are others that thought it was a tragedy, including, by the way, President Putin, who called it the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And I'll remind you that the 20th century was a pretty tragic century. Second, the idea of democracy got affiliated with other kinds of words: corrupt, ineffective government, weak government. And it happened simultaneously with a massive economic depression that I think compares to what the Soviet Union endured during World War II, some economists have compared it to our economic depression and say that it was an order of magnitude 3 times greater than what we experienced in the 1930s. Fourth, markets, are supposed to be good things. Well, others said, no, markets are good for some people, not for all people, and an identity with this group called the oligarchs, where markets were not producing for everybody, they were producing for a handful of people. And then the West was in this counter-revolutionary argument, taking advantage of Russia, not integrating Russia, when Russia was weak. And so this was an idea that had been percolating in Russia really since the beginning, since August 1991, but had been percolating along in the 90s and in the previous decade. And eventually got a champion of these ideas in Vladimir Putin. And these are some of the things he did during his first 8 years in power. Now, Putin's more complicated than just a counter-revolutionary figure. Remember, Anatoly Chubais is the guy that gave him his first job in Moscow. One of the neoliberal economic reformers hated by those making the counter-revolutionary argument. You need to remember that fact when trying to understand Putin. You cannot discount the fact he has first job in government. No, that's not true. His first job in government was interesting. But his first job in elected government was for Anatoly Sobchak, the mayor of St. Petersburg, one of the heroes of the democratic revolution. So it's too easy to say that he was part of this all the time. But over time, he accepted some of these arguments, particularly in relationship to the United States. And so by the end of 2008, particularly after Russia's invasion of Georgia, and I did choose the word invasion on purpose, the post-Cold War order looked rather shaky. There was lots of talk, if you go back and you read commentators, about the return to the Cold War back then. And that's when I entered government, right about that time. And we looked at those arguments, we looked at Russia, and particularly the president, who is most certainly a post-Cold War president in his way of thinking, his analytic setup. East and West is one dimension of the way he sees the world, but North and South is also another one. And when he looked at this new Cold War, he kept challenging the kind of assumptions that people like me, not people like me, were writing in terms of explaining this conflict. And he had a different approach that later became known as the reset. And I want to spell that out in some detail, in part because I want you to remember it, because it's going to be crucial to the end part of my explanation for the tragic period we're in now. This, by the way, is my 3rd day of work. My first day in the Oval Office as a government official. He's about to call President Medvedev, and I'm doing something you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to touch his desk, but nobody told me that. I learned later you're not supposed to do that. So what was the reset? What was our thinking about how to reset relations with Russia starting in January 2009? I'm going to go through this rather quickly. I'm happy to tweet it out afterwards if you want the slides later. 3 or 4 big ideas and then a couple of caveats. First, our assumption, the president's assumption, was that the United States and Russia share common interests. There are certain challenges out there in the world that are challenges both to Russia and the United States. And in particular, as he said in his speech, this is at the New Economic School in Russia in July 2009, where he articulates his vision of U.S.-Russian relations, I think, most comprehensively. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this period, to go back and read that speech. And in that speech, he says, quite radically, for a U.S. president, especially speaking in Russia, the pursuit of power is no longer a zero-sum game. Progress must be shared. So that's our first analytic assumption about the reset. Second, the president and our administration tried to develop a multi-dimensional relationship with Russia, and not just one focused on arms control. We did focus on arms control. We focused on the New START treaty. I'm very proud of the fact that I was part of the team that negotiated that treaty. But at one point in the negotiations about that, I think we were talking about telemetry. How many people know what telemetry is? Okay, all right, this is Stanford University. Most people, when I talk about Russia, forgot about telemetry, and that's a really good sign in terms of the post-Cold War order. But maybe we have to remember it again as I think about where I'm going on the conclusion here. Anyway, we're talking about telemetry, we're explaining it, and at one point the president says, you know, we need to get this treaty done, but if all we talk about with Russia for 8 years, right, this is in 2009, is telemetry, we will not have reset relations with Russia because after all, Brezhnev and Nixon were talking about telemetry. We wanted to develop this multi-dimensional relationship on the economy and society broader than just security issues. 3, the means for this, and I'll say more about this later, was engagement. The way you produce win-win outcomes is not just sit on your hand and hope it happens. You have to work at it, and you have to engage with Russian government officials at the highest levels and across the government, as well as society, to make this happen. 3 more principles of the reset. We believe that we could practice what we call dual track engagement. Engage with the government through government-to-government channels, and at the same time engage with society, business, civil society, artists, basketball players, as a way, and the theory is that there was more connectivity between our societies, there would be less misunderstanding, and more stakeholders in a cooperative, win-win type of relationship with Russia. That was the theory. By the way, we stole that from George Shultz and Ronald Reagan, if you want to know the origins. In fact, the entire reset is stolen right out of George Shultz's memoirs. The chapter, I think it's 27, if I'm not mistaken, is called Re-Engaging the Soviets. It's there. Go look it up. And he's not talking about Mikhail Gorbachev, by the way. He's talking about the regime before Mikhail Gorbachev. Lots of parallels, I think, to our situation. 5th, we believe we could reset relations with Russia without weakening our relations with other countries, especially countries near to Russia. And 6th, probably most controversially in Washington at least, we believe we could do this without linking issues that were unrelated. Again, another idea that we stole from the Reagan administration. But the idea was very simple, that if we're going to talk about Iran here, we're going to talk about Iran here. And if we don't like the way our negotiations are going on Iran over here, we're not going to link that to the WTO negotiations over here. That was our theory. We believe that if we linked everything up together, we would achieve nothing. So let's keep these in parallel tracks. By the way, we also rejected Russia's attempt to link certain issues. So there were many times when I was in government when a Russian official would say, you know, if you stop talking about democracy, we might make more progress on security issue X, Y, or Z. And we said, no, that's not our policy. We're going to do these things in parallel at the same time. All right, 2 more secret hypotheses. I realize there's a camera on there, and not really secret. And believe me, having served as U.S. ambassador for a couple of years and use a cell phone, I know nothing is secret and nothing is off the record. But 2 more implicit hypotheses that were more controversial, I would say, within our own administration. Here's me talking about them secretly with the president in Los Cabos, Mexico, of all strange places to have the U.S. ambassador to Russia. 7, integration will make Russia a more responsible stakeholder in the international system. That was part of our theory. We were going to co-opt them and bring them in and make them a stakeholder. And 8th, and this I think would be more contested in our administration, a benign external environment can create the permissive conditions for internal change in Russia. And that, by the way, is my reading of the case for the end of the Soviet Union. It was a benign external context that allowed the democratic movements in Russia to succeed. It was not a belligerent confrontational one. And I'm sure that's controversial. I can see brows frowning right now. Let's come back to it in questions, okay? But that was my theory. All right, we'll skip this. I'm going on too long. I want to just make sure you understand that this dual track engagement piece was real. Because some of our critics say, that Obama didn't really care about democracy and human rights. He didn't actually take the engagement of society seriously. I disagree. I was there. These are the president's words. These are not Michael McFaul's words. Talking about values and why it's important to promote them, why the arc of history is on the side of democracy, why, even if you could give a damn about these in terms of your ethical ways of thinking about them, and you just cared about security and prosperity, why the promotion of what we called universal values was good for security and was good for prosperity, first and foremost for the American people, but also for our allies. Those are his words in Moscow, again, July 2009. All right, the means, I've already talked about it, but I just want to make sure you understand how seriously we took this idea of engagement with Russia when we first came to power in January 2009. And the idea of respect, I should have mentioned this earlier. It's something the president deeply believes in. Given his own background, of course you all know, he feels very comfortable in a multicultural environment. He takes very seriously the idea to show empathy for a different point of view. Doesn't mean he's going to agree, but he is a listener, and most certainly with respect to Russia, he went out of his way, both privately and here publicly, to talk about respectful engagement. And there I am at the 70th anniversary of the Battle of Stalingrad as ambassador. Engagement, so lots of levels of engagement. Leaders, governments, business, society. There I am, by the way, doing my favorite part of engagement as U.S. ambassador, when we had these fantastic concerts of American performers, where I had to have them in my house, that's in Spaso House, and invite all kinds of Russians and engage them. For those of you who really follow Russian politics closely, I want you to note, if you can see me sitting there, 3 down is somebody very vocal these days in terms of the Ukrainian crisis. His name is Sergei Markov. One of the see the camera on. Let me think of a good diplomatic way to describe Sergei Markov. A vehement, passionate proponent of the Kremlin's policy everywhere, especially in Ukraine. But it's our job to engage everybody. Okay, presidential engagement. Remember, there wasn't a lot of engagement at the highest levels in 2008. We decided to take it very seriously. That's the president engaging with Medvedev on his first trip and what came to be his last trip to Moscow in July 2009. There we are with Putin. Incredibly interesting meeting, by the way. 3.5 hours breakfast out at his dacha, engaging both Putin and Medvedev. There's Medvedev in Washington. That was the day after he spoke at Stanford, by the way. And for those of you who were there, talked about how incredible Stanford was, loved Stanford, and really was happy to have his new iPhone that Steve Jobs had given him. Here we are engaging again, the vice president in Moscow with Vladimir Putin, with a pretty interesting look on his face. So engagement at the high level. Then we created something called the Bilateral Presidential Commission. And the idea here was a simple one, that we wanted not just this top-level engagement, but we wanted to increase vertical engagement across the United States government and the Russian government. And so I hope you can see, we initiated and we forced bureaucrats to engage with Russian officials on everything, virtually everything that was going on in our bilateral relationship. Third, engaging business. Big part of the reset was try to stimulate trade and investment. And here the president is at the American Chamber of Commerce, by the way, not a very friendly place for him usually, with President Medvedev in town, with 50 of the largest companies and small business folks from Russia and America. VC investors, we and I was very interested in trying to bring not just the big companies that have been in Russia for all time, but to try to bring people here from the Silicon Valley. This is one of the first things we did back in 2010, I believe it was. Everybody there, except 1 or 2, are people from the Valley who had never traveled to Russia, here we are being hosted by Dmitry Medvedev. Engaging society. I said we engage everywhere. This is the president playing basketball with young high school basketball players from Russia. I also shot a few shots. Ambassador Kislyak in the background there, he decided not to shoot. But it was a great day, a great sunny day. That's the courts. That's the basketball court at the White House. There's the president taking dual track engagement very seriously. Here he is in the G20 summit, September 2013. This was 2 hours after he had just met with Vladimir Putin to cut the chemical weapons deal, the deal to remove and destroy chemical weapons from Syria. A very important achievement. 2 hours later, here he is meeting with some of Putin's most vocal critics in civil society. There I am engaging religious leaders as ambassador. There's the president with political leaders. I just wanted to remind you that this did not start with me, as has been written, in meeting with the opposition. That's the back of the president's head, July 2009. Sitting across from him is Gennady Zyuganov, the head of the Communist Party. To the left of Zyuganov is Boris Nemtsov, about as ideologically opposite as you can get from Mr. Zyuganov. To the right of Mr. Zyuganov is Elena Mizulina, who's now on our sanctions list, by the way. So this meeting will not happen in Washington. But that was the wide spectrum, engaging everybody. That was our policy. Results. I'm going to go quickly over here this, but I think they were significant. And many of them are still enduring despite our conflicts right now. First, security. We got the New START treaty done. Lowered nuclear weapons in both of our arsenals. And as importantly, to me, continued the very important principle of trust but verify in making sure that we continued inspections of each other's arsenals. Second, Northern Distribution Network. To me, one of the most important things I did in the U.S. government. And I'll bet you most of you don't know about it, but we have been fighting a war in Afghanistan, which you all know. At the beginning of our administration, 90% of the supplies to our troops and our civilians in Afghanistan went through the southern routes, principally through Pakistan. Under the reset, we changed that, and we developed this northern route. So today, about 50% of our supplies going in, and now, importantly, going out, go through this northern distribution network, of which Russia is a vital component. Not since World War II have U.S. soldiers flown through Russian airspace. That was happening in the first 3 years, and still continues to happen as a result of the reset. Third, Iran. We have had, in my view, tremendous success working with Russia in trying to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. We started with a more cooperative strategy in the Tehran research offer. That was a joint U.S.-Russia deal. When that failed, when they rejected it, and they rejected us and the Russians, very important, we then pivoted to sanctions and put in place the most comprehensive set of sanctions ever adopted by the Security Council, UN Security Council Resolution 1929. And it's my view that it's a result of those sanctions that we're now having the progress we are having in the P5+1, of which Russia is a vital player and a partner of the United States to this day. In fact, they're meeting this day. Second tier effects. These are less important, but I don't think trivial. North Korea, we haven't had a lot of great progress, but it's not because of a disagreement with Russia. We're on the same side of that issue. We just are on a different side of that issue with the North Koreans. Lockdown of nuclear materials, an initiative that the president started. Russia's our partner on that. Fighting terrorism. Most of this I can't talk about because I signed the same papers that Mr. Snowden did, but I'm going to respect my commitment to the government. But there are lots of things that happen between the United States and Russia because we have common enemies around the world and we cooperate on that. And the other list, the dogs that don't bark, I think are important. You didn't read about the second Russian-Georgian war. Even though in 2009 and 2010, I would say that as my job at the National Security Council, well, I don't know percentages, but I spent a great deal of time interacting with the Russian government to make sure that there wasn't another conflict in the Caucasus, and history will show how close from time to time we got. This was an important achievement that meant real engagement with Moscow, real engagement with Tbilisi, and it was a better time, if not an ideal time in terms of peace and stability in the Caucasus. Okay, and I just, as a reminder, I just remember all of this is not ancient history. This is just 3 years ago. You need to keep that in your back of your mind when I get to my punchline. These are American and Russian soldiers training together in an anti-terrorist operation. I think this is in 2011 in Denver. Think about what you're reading in your newspapers and just remember this was happening just 3 years ago in Denver, outside of Denver. Economic results, modest but I think significant. We got Russia into the WTO. That was a U.S.-Russian initiative. We lifted Jackson-Vanik and granted PNTR for Russia, permanent normalized trade relations. That, I think, over time will have long-term positive consequences for the United States and Russia. We did a new visa regime that made it easier to travel between our two countries. You now can get a 3-year multiple entry visa to Russia and vice versa. That's a big achievement. That will increase, and has increased, as I'll show you. I'll show you right there, 51% since 2010 in terms of travel. We signed the 123 agreement, which will create the regime for civilian nuclear cooperation. Our current problems are going to freeze this for now. Over time, it will be something I think important. And, we began conversations about rule of law and innovation. We had momentum, in other words, about increasing trade and investment. Those are some of the numbers. They're small numbers, but they were moving in the right direction over the course of the first term of our administration. And there, just to remind you, all the big companies, they're all in Russia. And many of the big Russian companies, the lesser known list, are investing here in the United States. Then I just want to remind you that, every day when I got up as ambassador and went to work, there were literally thousands of Russians and Americans doing something together. Whether it's in space or Text for Baby, there's lots of Americans in government, outside of government, in business, in civil society, that were doing a lot of, I think, unnoticed but very important things. There's the increased travel numbers. I'll skip over that. And as a result of all this, I think, you had a different attitude towards our country in Russian society, literally just 2 or 3 years ago. You can see it went down to 17%. That's during the Russian-Georgian War. But in the heyday of the reset, those that had a favorable attitude towards the United States, 60%. And here's just another way to look at that over time in a bigger way. By 2010, an ally or friendly country, over 60% of Russians thought we were an ally or friendly country to Russia. And not surprisingly, if you break that down in terms of generations, big disparities. The younger you were, the more positive you were about the United States. All right, so what happened? That sounds like a great story, right? I should have retired in 2010. What happened? How could all of that stuff be going on, and now we're where we're at today? Now, I already prefaced this, but let me go through this a little in detail about why I think this has to do with individuals and domestic politics in Russia, and less to do with these longer-term arguments. And here's the way I would summarize the current debate I see both in Russia and in our country about why are we at this new confrontational phase. The first argument is realism, right? It's about the balance of power in the system. And it's very simple. Russia is a rising power with new capabilities, and this is what great powers do. Great powers push around smaller powers, especially those on their borders. By the way, there's a lot of history that would support that theory about international relations most certainly in that part of the world, but I think, you know, I'm not an expert, but I think around the world. And not surprisingly, this is a rather popular argument, especially among Russian foreign policy elites and commentators. And in many ways, for them, this is a natural correction to what was this aberration of Russian weakness in 1990, 91, 92. And the evidence to that is now some people want to put poor Mikhail Sergeyevich on trial for the crimes that he committed in weakening Russia 25 years ago. So, and you know, here's just some of the way Vladimir Putin thinks about these questions. And the way I think about this is most certainly it's a necessary condition for explaining the confrontation now. If Russia were weak, Russia would have less capabilities to do what they're doing inside Ukraine today. But it's not a sufficient condition, because I can think of a different kind of regime and a different attitude towards relations to Ukraine and towards the West. In fact, I don't have to use too much of an imagination. I can remember the period I just described for you. You don't have to, you know, the bigger counterfactual is imagine Russia succeeded in consolidating democracy. Imagine Russia succeeded in consolidating, you know, functioning market institutions back in the 90s. My argument would be this would be impossible to see this kind of aggression towards Ukraine today. But if you don't have a big enough imagination to think about that, and I understand that it really requires an imagination, just think about the shorter term counterfactuals of what I just described. Moreover, tell me the speech that Putin did years ago, where he said it's our natural destiny that we're going to unite the Russians of Crimea with Russia. That this is the reason I was reelected in 2012, was to rebuild and bring these folks in. That wasn't his strategy until just a few months ago. When I was U.S. ambassador, the most important foreign policy objective for Vladimir Putin and his administration was creating the Eurasian Economic Union. Didn't get a lot of attention in our press. Most certainly should have got more attention in our government. But this was what he was trying to create. His solution, his response to the European Union. And essential for making that work was to have all of Ukraine, not just Crimea, all of Ukraine and its 43 million people to be a part of that. So if that's your project, you can't explain the invasion of Crimea if that project was real, and I think it was real. Moreover, you can't explain some very short-term things that were happening in the final weeks that I was ambassador. He let out Mikhail Khodorkovsky from jail. And I was told by a very senior Russian official that was designed to help repair relations between our two countries. You don't do that if you're planning to go into this confrontation with the United States. He let out the Pussy Riot singers. And then he threw this incredible party. Some people say it cost him $50 billion. Is anybody there? Is anybody in Sochi by chance? That's too bad. I was there twice. It was a fantastic party. It was an incredible event. And if you were Russian and you were proud of that event, you should be proud. Because it went up, you know, forget about the broken toilets and the, you know, yes, there were marginal problems, including our hotel, by the way, that didn't get finished. But we eventually stayed in a very nice place, the presidential delegation that was there. But in general, the message of that Olympics, and if you saw it on TV, you saw it, was this is the new Russia, right? Forget about the Soviet Union. Forget about confrontation with the West. This is the new Russia. All those kids, those 20-year-old kids in those really colorful outfits, I don't know if you saw them, 30,000 of them were running around, and their job was to make you feel good about Russia. They spoke fluent English. One day I signed more autographs as a U.S. ambassador in Sochi than I'll sign for the rest of my life. That was the spirit, right? The messaging in the opening and closing ceremonies was about the new Russia, not about, you know, it was very nuanced about how to deal with the Soviet period. But they were trying to say, we want to be part of the international community. We're not trying to be in confrontation with the international community. And one of the things that was really striking for me was in the closing ceremony, First of all, Russia, the folks that did this program, and there are people I know, had incredible audacity to do a whole closing ceremony featuring Russian culture. And then they had a feature where they featured Russian writers. And now think about how many countries could pull that off. I'm not sure we could pull it off, right? Where they were rolling through the stadium, and they would flip them out, these writers from Russian history. There are very few countries in the world that have the cultural richness to be able to do that. But what was most striking to me was when they flipped up Solzhenitsyn and when they flipped up Brodsky. That was a message to people like me saying, we're the new Russia, and we're going to reclaim these people as part of our history. We're not the old Soviet Union. So something else has to be part of the explanation. It can't just be the rise of Russia as a power. All right, quickly, because these I think are silly ones, but I want to make sure you understand why I think they're silly. It's all our fault. We in the West, right? All our fault. Either because we did too much or we did too little. So one argument is that we pushed Putin, we pushed him into the corner with NATO and Serbia and Iraq and our support for color revolutions, and therefore he had no choice but to respond and to go into Crimea. That's an argument that is churning in our society and most certainly in Russia. Now, I don't want to be too flippant about this argument. And in fact, this is a piece I wrote, note the date, August 19th, not 1991, 1990. That's exactly a year before the coup is on. And I just illustrated as a concern that I had for a long, long time in worrying that we were not going to do enough to consolidate democracy in markets, and we were going to just say, the Cold War is over, let's have a party at the Hoover Institution and forget about it. We did have a party at the Hoover Institution, so this was lingering, and most certainly it's part of Putin's narrative to explain what he's doing now. But there's some problems with this blaming the West that compelled Russia to do, compelled Putin to do what he did. And that has to do with the story I just told about the reset. NATO expansion, right? He had to push back. How many countries joined NATO in the Obama era? How many? Is it 2? Is it 4? I think it's 0. No, I think Albania did. I'm mistaken. I'm sorry. There's one negotiation I may have missed. I was not working on it. My point is, I was there for every single meeting between the president and the heads of state of Russia in the last 5 years. The theme of NATO expansion was never a subject that we discussed because it simply was not an issue over the last 3 to 5 years. So why all of a sudden did it reappear in the last 3 weeks? That to me doesn't make any sense. Even missile defense. We did some big things to change that and to alleviate that problem in terms of U.S.-Russian relations. And remember, I should have brought the quote, but Barack Obama, when he went and gave that speech in Moscow in July 2009, said, again, historically, we think it is in America's national interest to have a prosperous, strong Russia. Think about that. There's no U.S. president that's ever said that. Maybe there was before the Soviet Union. I don't know that history well. There's somebody here that does. But most certainly didn't happen in the Cold War, and most certainly hadn't happened in the post-Cold War era. And I'll tell you, I was part of the writing of that speech, and those words, that was a dangerous thing to say. Some people in our administration did not want him to say that. He believed in it, because he thought we were doing something else. And moreover, you can't have the reset, everything I just described, if it's all because of what we did in the 90s and what we did in terms of NATO explains the problems of today. The other argument, the flip side of this, and you can correlate this Republican-Democrat pretty closely, by the way. So this is an argument you see from critics of Obama, that he's weak, that he created the permissive conditions, and that because he wasn't strong enough pushing back on Putin, that compelled Putin to invade Crimea. And I would just remind you that well before Crimea, we were already in a more pushback time. President Obama not only was the one that said we need a strong Russia, but as things were going off the rails under the Putin era, was also the guy that canceled a summit that unfortunately I spent a year of my life planning with my colleagues at the embassy, but that was already happened. But even if you don't buy that, I would remind you that the record of US presidents deterring Russian military aggression in Eastern Europe is consistent and poor. That is, just remember George W. Bush failed to keep the Russians out of Georgia in 2008. Ronald Reagan, I don't think anybody would accuse Ronald Reagan of being a weak leader, and yet when General Jaruzelski colluded with Brezhnev to crack down on one of the most powerful popular movements in the 20th century, they failed to deter that as well. Johnson, of course, in '68. Dwight D. Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, who ran on roll back communism, that was his phrase. When the tanks rolled into Hungary, they failed to deter it. And of course, going all the way back to Roosevelt. I think the pattern here is pretty consistent. When Putin was sitting with his friends, and they were just his close friends, talking in Sochi about whether they should go into Crimea or not, they rightly calculated that there would not be a military response from the United States or the West. All right, so my last two arguments, and then I'll take your questions. Last two components. And here I'm now in, I spoke rather emphatically about why those last two arguments are wrong. Here I'm on a little thinner ice with this one. I'm going to admit it to you up front. So take a whack at me if you want on this one in particular. So it's my belief, and I've written about this when I was here before, is that there's a relationship between the internal construction of a government and its external behavior, right? That there's a relationship. It's not just about these unitary actors called states bouncing around in conflict with each other. It matters how they're organized internally. And one of the things that President Obama said in his speech in July 2009, which is, I think, a finding of historical research and political science, is that democracies don't fight each other. Now there are some aberrations, I know, there's some exceptions, and it depends on how you code Great Britain in 1812. We can have that debate, I'm happy to. But I dare you to tell me, especially in the more recent time, of an adversary of the United States, a real adversary, not just one that we have noise with, that was a democracy. And now think about our 200-year history and the wars that we fought, including against non-state actors like Al-Qaeda. And you'll find that all of them are autocrats or those that don't believe in liberal democracy. And so I think this has been true of our relationship with the Soviet Union as well. I don't think it's just a coincidence that we had the Cold War at a time when there was totalitarian dictatorship in the Soviet Union. And the Cold War ended as Russia began to change politically internally. And that period moved in a more cooperative way with the West. And when I was ambassador in Russia, Russia was moving in a rapidly more autocratic way. And that, here, my argument is that as Russia becomes more autocratic internally, becomes more belligerent externally. And in particular, I want to just remind you that if you think about other belligerent times in Russian history, including in the 90s, there were some constraints. I think of the Chechen War under Yeltsin, for instance, when that was hardly a perfect democracy by any means. But the constraining institutions that might check this kind of use of power were all much weaker in 2014 than they were in 2012. There's some problems with my argument because Putin's actions, of course, as we know, are very popular right now. He went from 43% approval rating to 80%. So there's a problem with that. Of course, it's easier to have 80% approval rating when you control all the media and there's no opposition in the parliament and you vote for the use of power and you get 100% approval from your Senate. That generally doesn't happen in democracies. But there is a tension here, and I just want to admit it up top that there's a problem in just focusing on the institutions. And that's why I have to then pivot to my last and what I want to present to you as the most important driver of the story, and that's Vladimir Putin. And specifically, his specific responses to democratic challenges internally that then lead him in a more antagonistic relationship with us, culminating, punctuated with his intervention in Crimea. So here's what happened in 3 minutes. December 2011, there were parliamentary elections in Russia. Remember, just 2 months before that, Putin had decided he's going to run for re-election in the spring of 2012. And like most elections, I would say, there were falsifications in those parliamentary elections. Most elections in Russia over the last 20 years, including through the 90s, by the way. I think there's a consistent pattern. But something different happened in December 2011. People documented the gross falsification, the irregularities in this election. And then, because they were upset about that, but they were also upset about this changeroo thing, Rakirovka, right, in Russian, that Medvedev and Putin did, they demonstrated on the streets against the regime. Tens of thousands of people demonstrated, and at a couple of times, hundreds of thousands of people demonstrated against the regime, saying, we want a more democratic regime. We want more democracy. We're not going to take it anymore. That's what was happening right about the time that I became U.S. ambassador. And there became, from the regime, and particularly from Putin, a response to that. And let me go back a little bit to just give you more feeling for the contingency of my argument. Medvedev was still president then. Medvedev's initial response was, we got to work with these folks. We got to work with the democratic opposition. We got to use this moment to democratize our political system. He met with them. There's a lot written in the Russian press about my meetings with the Russian opposition. I'll get to that in a moment. The first time I met with the entire democratic opposition was at Medvedev's house, in the coach room, where they were coming in, we were going out. That's when I actually met with the democratic opposition in Russia. And they were there to negotiate a different kind of relationship between the state and society, and they came up with a few ideas. One was, let's have a PBS-like television station, or BBC, or whatever, take your choice. Medvedev said, I'm open to that. Let's have elections for governors. That was one of the demands. Medvedev said, I'm open to that, and he actually did it for a while. So that was one response from a Russian leader. And I want to emphasize that because, to me, it's not inevitable that Putin's response had to be. There was another response, and you don't need a big imagination. It was the guy that was in power right before him that did this other response. Putin had a different view. Putin decided we had to crack down on these folks. They were threatening. We had to arrest them. We had to constrain the space for civil society. And as part of that strategy, he needed us as an enemy again. He needed us to rally his electoral base and to delegitimate these people that were protesting against him. So here he is running for president. This is something he said. Remember, the reset was just going on, just literally, a few months before this. This is his response to the reset, if you will. Reviving an old enemy. Then he talks about the opposition. This is even before the parliamentary elections and what we were doing to support the opposition. This is his view. He's now rolling out an old playbook from an earlier time. And then you can just see, there's folks here that I know the Soviet era pretty well. You don't need to translate the words. You can just see the imagery that was resurrected during this period. And then they got to me. By my second day in office in Russia, ambassador, I hadn't even presented my credentials yet. I became a really, really useful part of this propaganda campaign. In part because of the book that you chose to read about, to note, Norm. You didn't note the book I wrote about U.S.-Russian relations, Power and Purpose, and how we were cooperating in the post-Cold War era. You talked about the book I wrote about Ukraine. Well, guess what? on television every night, especially during the presidential campaign, but really for my 2 years as ambassador, and actually it's still going on. What I wrote about the Orange Revolution, they then molded that to say that Barack Obama had sent me to Russia to foment a color revolution against his regime. That was a view, and they developed this over time. This is a cover of a calendar circulating then, and every month you can flip to another opposition figure that are part of McFaul's girls. Here I am funding, these are all leaders of the opposition. These are all my wooden soldiers. This one is from the 6th of May, Bolotnaya, for those of you who follow Russia closely, where this was a big demonstration that eventually many people got arrested, and many of them are still in jail today. This was a poster that you could find throughout Moscow that day. And you can see me in the middle there, and those are all the various different political opposition leaders. Navalny is to the right, for instance. A man, by the way, I never met once, ever, as U.S. ambassador. But in the Russian press, he was my guy. In fact, there I am, campaigning for Navalny. That's Photoshop. So for the camera, that is a Photoshop. That is not real. My arms are not that long, but this was the way I was portrayed as part of, building this image of the enemy. Okay. That's the end of the reset and the run into our current moment. But it's not sufficient, because even during that period, as I said here and then skipped, Putin was compartmentalized. On the one hand, he saw us as the enemy. And he literally would sit across the table from the president or the secretary and say, I know you are here trying to undermine my regime. And he wouldn't look at the secretary, he'd look at me. He made that very clear to me, that he didn't like what we were doing. Even though, I want to be clear, we weren't doing anything. We were not funding the opposition. We didn't give $1 to Navalny during the Obama administration. I don't know what happened before, but we had an explicit, emphatic policy of not funding the opposition during our time. But that was his view, that was his argument. And at the same breath, right after we talked about that, he would talk about the cooperation that was necessary for us on things like ExxonMobil, Rosneft, Syria, and even Sochi, as I mentioned before, was really disappointed that Barack Obama did not come to Sochi. So both of these things you need to understand are part of Putin and his worldview. And are they contradictory? Yes. Do you have some preferences that are sometimes contradictory? I'll bet we all do, right? The one I like to talk about is I gained some weight as ambassador. We had some incredible feeding frenzies with our fellow ambassadors and society. And so here, when I sit down at dinners, I want to lose some weight. And yet, when a chocolate chip cookie is put in front of me, I also want to eat the cookie. Two preferences, I have them both. They're both in my head. They're real. One is not more prevalent than the other. Sometimes one trumps the other. Same with Putin. He understands, and he doesn't like the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed, and he lamented that, right? Called it the greatest tragedy. But people forget the other part that he said in that quote. He said, those that don't lament the collapse of the Soviet Union don't have a heart. Those that want to recreate the Soviet Union don't have a brain. He also said that. And those dual impulses were there throughout the entire time I was in the government, until February 21st, when the Yanukovych government collapsed. And then his old theory about us was proven correct in his view. We lie, and we use covert assistance to overthrow regimes we don't like. And that's when he said, to hell with it, I'm going to respond in this different way. And that, I think, is the explanation for the order we're in today. Now, just briefly, because I've gone on longer than I wanted to, there are similarities and differences to the Cold War, and you need to have both of them in mind to think about what the appropriate response is. Is this a struggle about ideas? Yes, it is in my view. Think of the counterfactual from my argument. If Russia were a liberal democracy today, we would not be in the confrontation we're in. Second, does Putin see us as the enemy? Absolutely. NATO's and Nazis, the two N-words. Those are just every single night now, NATO and Nazis. That's, if you're living in Russia or you're watching television, NATO's and Nazis are all over the place, and of course, that's us. 3, the Kremlin has the intention and capacity to undermine governments and states, as they did during the Cold War period. That is true. And 4, most issues are now framed in this zero-sum way. And 5th, on some very specific places, we can still continue to cooperate. And that cooperation is still happening, just as it did during the Cold War. There are also some really important differences, though. The appeal of the Kremlin ideology is minimal, does not really extend beyond Russia and maybe Eastern Ukraine. Russia has no allies. I mean, they have some, but when they roll them out, it's kind of embarrassing. Third, as the president said, and I know it didn't go down well in Russia when he said it, but Russia is a regional power, is not a superpower in terms of capacity. That's a big, important difference. Fourth, and I think this is probably most important, Russians are not as isolated as their parents and grandparents were during the Cold War. Over time, not right now, not when we're all hyped up about nationalism, but over time, this is going to be the key reason why this period of confrontation is not going to be as long as the last period of confrontation. There are other 2 differences, though, that play in a more negative way. And I would just say, and I know this is controversial, but the moral authority of the United States, I think, in Russia is less today than it was at the end of the Cold War. I experience that every single day in trying to defend our policies abroad. And 6, we are now moving in a period of isolation, not engagement, and I think that's a negative in terms of how we deal with this struggle. So what's the way forward? I've written about this, and so I don't want to dwell on it now. I'll take your questions on it. But my philosophy is, if you will, isolate the regime and engage society and contain aggression of Russia beyond its borders. That's my 6-point plan for how to make this current period of confrontation to be shorter than the last one. And the 6th one is very important. It was a key piece of what Kennan did in outlining his first containment policy. Above all costs, we have to avoid open military confrontation with Russia. All right, I'll take your questions. Thank you. You've been patient.
Thank you for that great discourse. What is the connection between China, which is a growing... What is the connection between China and Russia? China wants oil, Russia's got oil. What's going on with that? Are they friends? Because I hear they are.
Well, China wants oil. You're right about that. They want gas, and they're working with the Russians to receive that. That's without question. And on many international security issues in a multilateral context, the Russians and the Chinese vote together, right? So in the Security Council, by and large, they vote together. They did not vote together on the resolution about Crimea, by the way. The Chinese did not support Russia. They abstained. Very, very important departure with the Russians on that. The way I would describe it generally, though, is they both like the short-term cooperation in the short term, and both countries, especially Russia, is nervous about their partner in the long term. And especially in Russia, I would say that's the case because of demographics and economics. Russia shares a border with China, and on one side you have 120 million, 130 million Chinese, and on the Russian side there's 2 million Russians. And the demographics, the migration, the pressures that you have whenever you have borders like that, that's real, and people in Russia see that as a long-term threat to their security. And but not in the short term. In the short term, they're more aligned. Yeah, Fury, how you doing?
Yeah, like this is very strange since my question was also about China, also from literally different perspective. So first of all, like I disagree with 2 statements in your presentation. So your first statement is that
Excuse me, can we have a question, please, because we don't have much time, so ask the question.
okay. So my question is, there are, you said that relationship with Russia, that US-Russian relationship is dead, it is dying, and also US main partners are democracies. But actually in Silicon Valley electronic industries, deals with Russia continues, and also at the same time, China is a priority #1 for Silicon Valley electronic companies, which raises two questions. One question is, why don't US uses those economic relationship between two companies which are going on without interruptions? Russians are coming to the design automation conference to San Francisco like in a few days, like even now and deals ago. And second is, why does US government doesn't penalize China for human rights? They have much more human rights problems than Russia, and China is not penalized, but with Russia there are constant talk of sanctions, FBI agent wrote column in Boston and so on and so on.
Okay, good question. When I was the U.S. ambassador, and even before then, as one of the slides showed, I agree 100% with you about why it's in the American national interest to increase economic ties between entrepreneurs in the Silicon Valley and entrepreneurs in Russia. I was a vocal 100% supporter of that. I went to bat for a lot of Russian companies in relations to matters of security clearances and visas and certain export controls, because I believe exactly in the same spirit of your question. And here, just to remind you, I went on too long, so I didn't go through this, but my fourth point of how we should deal in the new era is engage Russian society and Russian capitalists. Now, I use the word purposely. I didn't say Russian state-owned companies. I mean real people doing real things in the economy. I think that's real, and that's good. That's good for the United States. That's good for Russia. I support it. Even in this period of confrontation, I think those channels should keep alive. But let me warn you, not everybody in Washington agrees with me on that. There is a mood now that says we have to cut that out. We have to make the Russian economy fail as a way to undermine Putin. And that debate's going on right now. And the incremental response of sanctions that you see from the Obama administration, I think reflects that debate that's going on. Because some want to punish Putin for what he did, and others want to punish Putin, but they don't want to punish the young entrepreneur from Novosibirsk who's showing up in the valley to try to get some startup capital for his company. And that tension is real. With respect to China, I would say it's more or less the same policy. I used to sit across the hall at the National Security Council from my friends with China, with one big difference, is that the stakeholders that I described in the United States for more sustained relations with China are much larger than they are for Russia. And that's a reflection of the economic engagement, the level of trade, the level of foreign direct investment that we have with China that vastly is much larger than it is with Russia. And that just has to do with electoral politics and democratic politics that works that way. So my solution to that is we want to have more stakeholders in the U.S.-Russian relationship. When I was in the government, that was part of what I tried to do. Putin's made that harder for me. China did not invade a neighboring country and then annex it, just to be clear. That's a big, big difference. There's not been annexation by a country in decades. In fact, I'm not a historian, but I think you have to go back before World War II. It depends on how you code different countries. I think in Germany, okay. There are some, but not in this way. This puts them in a category different from China. Yeah.
Why nobody follows the Budapest Treaty? When Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapon, everybody was happy. Now they just observe what's going on.
That's a good question. I'm not a Russian government official. I think we're doing all we can to adhere to the principles of Budapest. And I think the administration's response and recognizing those commitments in concert with our European allies is the right one. It's not easy, and it's within the constraints of what is realistic and what the American people will support, by the way. Let's be clear about that. But I think they're trying to meet their commitments. Russia is not, in my view. Yeah.
Several times we said that Russia has invaded Crimea.
Yes.
Well, invasion is what America did to Iraq. Invasion is what America did to Afghanistan. The
Correct.
current do.
Correct.
Killing thousands of people and so on.
Correct.
Do you know how many people were killed in Crimea by Iraq?
I do.
How many?
Zero.
Zero. Do you call this invasion?
Yes.
Why?
Because the army of Russia overtook territory that is not part of Russia. Simple fact. What do you call what Hitler did in Sudetenland? That's not invasion.
Russia was always in Crimea for 300 years.
Oh, come on. Come on. The Greeks were there before the Russians. Does that mean the Greeks have a right to invade Crimea?
But there was referendum.
No, there wasn't a referendum.
Yes,
There was referendum.
Folks, come on. All right, let me answer more seriously. Okay.
They don't want to be Ukraine. They hate Ukraine.
How do you know? Okay, you just talked to your grandmother and I got it. Hold on. Okay, so what would you call it?
I call it a child going home to his mother. Somebody took your child away from you?
No.
That's what Hitler
First
said.
of all, where do you start rewriting history, okay? So, first of all, Crimea was part of the Soviet Union, right? It was I don't know where, it sounds like you may be from Russia. Are you from Russia?
Yeah.
So it was your leader that gave Crimea to Ukraine. It wasn't my leader, it wasn't the international community. NATO didn't occupy Crimea to say you have to be part of Crimea. It was your leader in the Kremlin that did it, okay?
It was Ukraine, by the way.
Who cares? It's part of the same country, my friend. You can't just say, oh, well, that was a mistake that he did. Well, that was, actually, we don't like, what if the Mexicans said, actually, it was a real mistake that we gave away Southwest America. We're going to come in and take it now. That's about the same period of history. You can't, once you start down that path, where does it end? What happens to Kaliningrad? Are you prepared to give Kaliningrad away? Do you know the history of Kaliningrad? Well, what would you do? Do we get to give that child back to Germany, to use your metaphor? Why not? So, yeah, you know why? Oh, yeah, why? Just like the Crimean Tatars, by the way. There are rules of the game. The whole reason the United Nations was set up was to not allow countries to unilaterally decide when to annex other countries. That was one of the principles. And if you could have the UN Security Council vote to say that we believe this is supported. And on the referendum, by the way, that referendum was a joke. That was not a real referendum. You do not have a referendum at the barrel of the gun. Do you know how many, I'm going to finish, okay? You had your question, I'm going to finish. 60% of the population there is Russian. 40% is not. And yet 95% voted for annexation? No way. That's not real. Read.
For returning home.
The Crimean Tatars are 20%. They're not even letting the leader of Crimea come back to his land. You think the Crimean Tatars voted for it? Come on. It was not a serious
You know
referendum.
why they didn't?
Okay, all right, yeah, you're right. You and I can talk another time. But yeah, we're not gonna come to any agreement. I can tell. Please.
I have a short remark. I think the popularity
He has a question, but
is based also on the fact that Homo Sovieticus is still alive and well in Russia. This is my opinion.
Okay, that's your opinion. By the way, before I forget, because I wanted to say it, the invasion of Iraq was an invasion, and it was against the rules. Did you support it? So if you don't support that one, how come you can support this other one?
We
See,
don't
there-
support the invasion.
All right, you're right. I forgot. There's no invasion. Right. The entire world voted that there was, but Russia didn't, and so we have
Barrel
to
of the
accept it.
gun is alive.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Ambassador. I really appreciate this talk. I was wondering if you felt the same sort of uncomfortableness that I felt we credit Putin as a singular individual and responsible for this change in policy. I feel like that this plays into his cult of personality. That Putin is a strong leader, and it's historically revised as a strong leader with bad advisors, and kind of airbrushed any sort of problems of history. So I was wondering what you think the danger is in giving Putin the full credit of this change in policy.
So you're right. I feel uncomfortable about it, and that's why I built these arguments. And I would say they're partial explanations, and to focus just on him would be wrong. You can't have Putin without the 90s and the things I described, without question. But I actually want you to think the main part of my argument is about contingency and is about individuals. And I think it's too easy to say that this was all inevitable. It all had to happen this way because of things that happened 50 years ago or 300 years ago, and this is all, it had to be this way. I don't believe that. And the reason I don't is because I see a lot of contingency even in his history. Putin did not run on a wave of popularity to become president. He was selected by Anatoly Chubais and Boris Berezovsky with the help of Boris Yeltsin. Let's remember that fact. That is a fact of Russian history, right? It wasn't that he was a leader of a popular movement and people voted for him, and he gave his speech about Crimea, by the way, and people said, hoorah, we need to do that. There was none of that. It was a deal done for very short-term reasons. That's how he became where he was. But moreover, I want to also make him more complex than I think he's sometimes portrayed here. He's not comfortable with what he's doing right now, in my view. He's nervous about it. He's really nervous about it. He's got his arguments, and he's obviously convinced some that they're legitimate. I understand that. But he's also realizing that in the long term, it may be the downfall of a bigger project that he was also doing. And I think that's important. You gotta, like I said, you gotta be able to hold both of those different kinds of preferences in your mind. And then the third piece, right now he is a leader who is unchallenged and does not have people around him. There's no interest group politics in a way there was, say, 15 years ago when he was first president. But that can change over time. That will change over time. And if the economy tanks, and if there are more sanctions, I mean, you've already seen the effects of sanctions, and if Russia's by the Russian government, you don't have to believe me. Minister Lukayev just said the other day, Russia is in a recession, right? If that continues and goes into a depression over 3 to 5 years, then there's going to be a debate in Russia. Am I, now that my ruble buys half of what it used to buy, and I'm unemployed, was it such a great thing that we put $40 billion into making Crimea part of Russia? That debate could happen. And then it'll become more complex. But right now, that kind of interest group politics is not happening because Putin is driving this right now, pretty independently. Yes? One more question, yeah. 2 more questions, right? I pointed to 2 people, yeah.
When will we have an ambassador again to Russia?
You have to call the White House, I don't know. I really don't know. Nobody could replace me. No, I'm just kidding. But in all seriousness, the sooner the better, in my view. We need somebody there. We have a fantastic VCM, just so you know, the person that used to work for me. She's doing an incredible job, so we're in good hands, but it's time to get a new ambassador. Yeah, last question.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I wanted sort of to present a counter-argument to what you were talking about. So you presented the view where relations and the situation with Russia was going really great, and then there's a sudden collapse. But looking from the point of view of the society, it seems, at least to me, that things weren't going all that great. It's actually tightening of the screws for a very long time, and now it's tightening even more, but it's not a sudden change in what's going on inside Russia, and therefore our relations. So what can you answer to that kind of argument?
So I'm glad this is a good place to end. So the counter argument to me is that my little time in government was the aberration, right? Our little reset thing, that was the aberration. And I'm trying to get the data that will help to show it. And that the real trend lines were in this negative way. And I think that's partially true. So again, it's not so simple. The trend lines for democracy, for instance, in Russia, had gone in a very negative direction well before the reset happened. By different people's accounts, right? Experts that do that, not me. There was this tightening. So that is all true. But it's also true that it wasn't inevitable that this was going to end this way. And the reason it doesn't feel so inevitable to me is that I didn't go to the demonstrations. I want to emphasize that. I was not there. I was not handing out cookies. I was in my embassy, watching it on TV. On Deutsch TV, but on TV. Because I saw those demonstrations. I saw that society wanted something different. And then I saw a regime and some individuals that also wanted something different. And I'm not going to name them, especially with cameras pointing at me, but you would be shocked at how many people in the Russian government that are feeling just as tragic about this moment as I am. Really senior people. That don't see this as in the long term. They're nationalists, they're patriots, just like Putin, or whoever supports this, right? But they have a different view about what it means to create a great power, to create a respected power. And they're feeling that they're quiet. This is a dangerous time to say that publicly. But they didn't go away. They didn't disappear. They're still working. And a lot of them are young. A lot of them are young and are playing a long game. And that is what I wanted to end on, and so I will, which gives me hope. Because I'm incredibly optimistic about Russia. Am I going the wrong way? I'm going the wrong way. We used to have a colleague here at Stanford, Seymour Martin Lipset was his name, great man, in the sociology department. Man, I have a lot of slides, I apologize. And Marty had a theory, he wrote this piece in 1959 about the relationship between economic growth and democracy. And the basic thesis was the more well-to-do a society is, the more likely they are to become democratic. Now, there's tons of problems with that theory in different places, in different historical moments. I myself have written about it, why it's problematic in certain ways, but over time, we used to joke with Marty. Marty's always right over time, over the long course of history. And the 20th century was tragic, but it ended in a very optimistic way. You go back 100 years, there's just a handful of democracies. Now there's, depending on how you count, 127, 125. And there is this relationship between becoming richer, more educated, and more connected to the world. Well, guess what? Russians are becoming richer. They're richer than they've ever been in their entire history, I would say, today. That's a great achievement. They're becoming more educated, and they're becoming more connected to the outside world. So that makes me actually very optimistic that at the end of the day, you don't have to have a PhD in political science to believe that if you're going to steal my money, it's called otherwise known as taxes, that I should have some say over how you spend it. Just that simple. No taxation without representation. You don't need a PhD. You don't need, this is something pretty, as President Obama would say, that's a universal value. That's not an American value. That's not a democratic Western value. It's not a European value. That's a universal value. And that's a value that is growing in strength in Russia. And so we're in this period now, but I think in the long run, just as Marty was right about a lot of other countries, he'll be right about Russia. I just don't know how long the interregnum will be. All right, thank you all.